Welcome to Readers of the Lost Art with your presenter, Dr. Paul Anthony Taylor, a recovering academic. And the title of today's talk is Christopher Nolan's IMAX Odyssey, A Wasted Journey. He was their servant, some say he was blind, who moved among their faces and their things. Their feelings gathered in him like a wind and sang. They cried, "It is a God that sings." W. H. Auden, Sonnets from China. There are many great authors of the past who have survived centuries of oblivion and neglect, but it is still an open question whether they will be able to survive an entertaining version of what they have to say. Hannah Arendt. Well, hi everybody, and remember from the epigraph this idea, and some say he was blind. They don't know the actual historical, the precise biographical details of the historical figure of Homer. It's rumoured that he was blind. Likewise, it could have been more than one person, helped to codify and collate and write down the epic poetry that was recited by what was the tradition of these itinerant speakers who'd go around and perform these epic tales and add their own little gloss. So you've got this, very old, ancient, one of the founding documents of Western civilization, the Iliad and the Odyssey. So you've got it's often referred to as Athens and Jerusalem. You've got the Western epic literature, poetry, and then on the other side, in the other side of the Mediterranean, you have the Hebrew Old Testament. So they're roughly around about the same time they were, being written down. And you can contrast that with what's coming out in July. Christopher Nolan is, as you can see in the picture, he really likes his IMAX cameras. I think it's July 17th they're bringing out this version of the Odyssey. And I thought it would be interesting to look at the philosophical components of the implications of how we as human beings interact with infinity and the beyond and the notion of gods. On the one hand, that's in Homer's epic, the Odyssey. And on the other hand, you have this auteur, this great director who's chosen that epic poem to make a film. So this will be the first of at least two videos. The next one I want to look at the specific issues that surround the images of trying to turn an epic poem into an image-dominated format, which is obviously the immersive experience of IMAX cinema. So I'll be looking at specifically the image elements next time. This time I wanted to look at the more philosophical issues because it's interesting. No one's seen the film yet, so you could see that as a disadvantage. I see it as an advantage in the sense that you can talk more objectively or without bias of the actual film about what are the implications of trying to turn an epic poem from classical times into actual cinema. This is from Christopher Nolan himself. And I love the name of the magazine this interview came from, Celluloid Junkie magazine. He says, IMAX film brings images to life. From resolution and colour to sharpness and overall quality, there's nothing compared to using IMAX film cameras today. Filmmakers and movie fans worldwide should be thrilled at the prospect of new and improved IMAX film cameras. I know I am. So he's obviously well attuned to the whole commercial enterprise of IMAX. But without being cynical, I just think it should be recognised Christopher Nolan really is an auteur. And along with a figure like I was going to call him Arthur, Alfred Hitchcock, there are certain, if anyone can turn the Odyssey into a worthwhile film, I'd put my money on Christopher Nolan. I'm still not convinced he's going to manage it. But if anyone could, I'd give lots Lots of film is, I would suggest, of questionable artistic status, but there are certain directors and certain films that I'd happily say, yeah, that's just brilliant art. So it will be interesting. And this is, most people I think by now will be familiar with the concept of IMAX cinema, but this is just a visual illustration of the phenomenon we're talking about to show how immersive and how in your face it is. And I've shown this several times on the channel, but the notion of Plato's cave from the Republic, is it book 7? My memory's going, I think it's book 7. But I just think it's interesting, this idea that the being in a cavernous space looking at shadows on a wall versus seeing the one true light. And in a certain sense, there's a reversal. I think IMAX cinema is much closer to being on the left, and yet the non-visual, word-based epic poem of Homer is paradoxically more towards the right. And we'll discuss that as we go along, this idea that you can actually perhaps you can get closer to the truth, the less technology, and the purer and more limited the art form is, in a sense. And this relates, this is philosophically and in terms of philosophy of the mind. The IMAX cinema reminds me of this model. It's called the Cartesian theatre. It's the idea that in our heads there is a little homunculus, a little person looking at images, and that's how we experience. It's like a mirror image of the world we're looking at inside our brains, and it's almost like an infinite regress. It's like an Escher drawing. But actually, I'm going to argue as we go along, whilst IMAX cinema is basically premised upon this model of perception, what poetry and what Homer's epic does and what philosophy does would actually, I think, undermine and question this type of model. So we'll see how convinced you are as we go. But this is what I'm talking about, this idea. You can see, I'd suggest the similarity between that notion of how we perceive the world, and then with IMAX, you just see how it's that image of looking at an apple on steroids. This is the whole premise of IMAX, is to take the notion of the Cartesian theatre of cognitive perception and take it, what did they say in Spinal Tap? Take it to number 11 on the dial. Turn it up to number 11. And then, I like this quote. Homer is, and probably always was from his baptismal naming, an idea of something that remains permanently lost to culture. Whether this be a heroic age, an ideal of unattainable poetic excellence, or a vague sense of some irretrievably lost past. So, forgive me if I'm going to talk about Homer in the philosophical and this notion of an irretrievably lost past, but to be fair to me, which I do like to be, Christopher Nolan started it by deciding to do a whole film on the Odyssey. And what I'd like to do, I want to do in an ideal world, I'd love to do, there are 24 books to the Odyssey, and I'd love to do about an hour and a half, I reckon I could do on each book, but I just don't think anyone's going to watch 24 episodes. But what I really do aim to do is to do at least 2 of the books, maybe the first 2 or 3, just to illustrate what lies behind the complexity, this amorphous nature of what Homer is, what he stood for, what the significance of his writing is, this permanently lost to culture, whether this be a heroic age, an ideal of unattainable poetic excellence, or a vague sense of some irretrievably lost past. I think if you look closely at the actual text of the Odyssey, you get all these associations. You get a sense of an era that's no longer with us. You get a sense of a whole culture that the more you read, the more you immerse yourself in the story, the more you do some background research to understand the terms being used and some of the rituals and some of the customs that are being described, the more you slowly realise that it was obviously a completely different world and era. But there's a shared humanity, and yet the ancient Greeks were completely different to us. And more than that, the whole writing down of Homer's text marked arguably a hinge point in Greek culture, while they left the old-fashioned traditional heroic times of clans and families protecting their own and the honor system, and they actually evolved into the polis, the city-state, and the golden age of Athens. So the Homer's epic actually represents an awful lot. And then that begs the question, how could a film possibly, it can provide as much IMAX high definition visual detail, it's at the limits of technological ability at the moment, but how much of this other stuff can it capture? And does that matter? And that speaks directly to the idea of an unattainable poetic excellence, or a vague sense of some irretrievably lost past. Will the IMAX film distract us from what's contained in the epic poem and what can't possibly be contained in the film? And to what extent, in an increasingly post-literate culture that we live in, can people actually follow the true depth of what's going on in the Odyssey, Homer's original epic poem? Like I say, if I do 2 or 3 sessions on the first 2 or 3 books, there's still 24. And I think Stuart, in the live stream I did with him talking about Proust, pointed out IMAX has this technical limitation of a film can only be 3 hours. So you're packing in 24 books that I could do an arbitrary hour and a half on each book, but you could just talk about each book for hour after hour after hour. There's so many layers of sedimented meaning. And all of this is going to be packaged in a 3-hour film, which, no matter how impressive and how skillful Christopher Nolan is, I'd argue it does point to something irretrievably lost past. You can't handle the truth, as what's his name says, Jack Nicholson in A Few Good Men. You can't handle 24 books worth. So we're getting something that is arguably lost. We're getting a IMAX packaged version of Homer. So to develop that point, this is the very beginning of the Odyssey. Tell me about a complicated man, Muse. Tell me how he wandered and was lost when he had wrecked the holy town of Troy, and where he went and who he met, the pain he suffered in the storms at sea, and how he worked to save his life and bring his men back home. He failed to keep them safe, poor fools. They ate the sun god's cattle, and the god kept them from home. Now, goddess, child of Zeus, tell the old story for our modern times. So I think it's a brilliant beginning. Tell me about a complicated man. And I'll develop this in future videos, but that's a crucial opening statement, because you could argue the Iliad is about outward-looking heroic deeds, it's war, it's battle. I think the first word is menin in Greek in the Iliad, which means rage. So it's in the beginning of the Iliad, it's, "O Muse, tell us of the rage of Achilles." He was a bit of a man-child, a bit of a spoiled brat. But anyway, versus that, you have Odysseus, who's "tell me about a complicated man." And arguably what's so significant about the Odyssey as a story is that it reflects the evolving nature of Greek society, and Odysseus becomes less of a hero and more of a manipulative chancer in a way. He's much more wily and cunning, and that is a marked difference to the type of behaviour manifested in the Iliad. So that "tell me about a complicated man" segues neatly with the final phrase, "tell the old story for our modern times." Arguably the Odyssey, and maybe this is one of the reasons Christopher Nolan picked it, it's an old story that has relevance for our modern times because it contains this notion of a complicated man. So you can tell I like this phrase, keep repeating it, but I've merged them together with a bit of ellipsis there. Tell me about a complicated man. Tell the old story for our modern times. So we've established IMAX as this high definition Odyssey. And like I say, in the next talk, I'll be pursuing the implications of this high definition, the juxtaposition of high definition visuality and the Odyssey as a story of a man's journey, and how that might play out, and how it might be an inherent contradiction. But what I want to talk about today are two or three themes. There's the epic form. So what was the epic? What was the Iliad and the Odyssey? How did this epic form? It's not, I sound like something from Star Trek, it's not poetry as we know it. It's, we call it poetry because that's how modern people understand what it was. It's all means of understanding it. But I'll explain shortly. The epic was something different. It wasn't just poetry. It was something unique to Greek culture at the time. And it reflected the worldview of the Greeks at the time, which, as I've suggested already, was vastly different to ours. So, off the top of my head, I'm trying to think of little things. I've mentioned in previous videos, the Greeks and most ancient cultures had a completely different relationship to ritual than we do. You know, constantly you stub your toe and you've been making a sacrifice to the gods. There's a constant sacrificing of poor domestic animals. But all this ritualism, there was an honor system, but also there was this notion of how they related to the gods was how they related to the external forces of nature. And the concept of an infinite. So you could see the epic form and the worldview of the Greeks within the epic, this recited story of lots of different moving parts that was well known to everyone and was told in the same basic form but with different tellers to a rapt audience. You're receiving this impression of a wonderful world in which the gods and the humans coexist, and the gods inhabit the world. So there's a concept of human mortality being contrasted with the immortality of the gods. So human beings in the story are relating to a bigger notion of eternity, but in a manageable way. The myths inhabit the story. The mythical gods are the background to the story, the tales of the heroic deeds. So that's quite an organic, natural, cultural way of dealing with the difference between mortality and immortality and humankind's relationship to the eternal. Now, we modern people obviously have a completely different relationship to the eternal. So if you're a modern person and you're not religious, the notion of the eternal arguably has been swallowed up by the concept of science, and science measuring everything, and science describing the cosmos. And insofar as science describes eternity, it tends to deal with the origins of the cosmos, the Big Bang, general theory of relativity, all these notions. Insofar as it's possible, science tries to give a sense of the measurability or the explainability of the cosmos. If you're religious, then you tend to have a relationship to a notion of the eternal through a divine god, or gods if you're Hindu. But what's interesting is that there are, for non-religious people who still want to have some sense of the eternal, art arguably plays part of that role by providing an outlet for notions of transcendence beyond the here and now. How do you get a sense of something more significant than the merely empirical? So I'll be exploring the notion of our relationship to the eternal, but this notion of the ground of being and the demonic. In the next talk, I'll explore the concept of the demonic with reference to Jean Baudrillard and the evil demon of images. He has this idea, the concept of hyperreality and simulation, the idea that our experience of reality becomes seductively and fatally undermined by, tongue-in-cheek, he says the evil demon of images. These images that disguise the fact that there's no longer any original reality left. Images aren't a representation of an actual reality anymore, according to Baudrillard. Images just hide the fact by pretending to represent something, that there is something to represent beyond mere images, because in his eyes, we live in this hyper real where we live in images of images. My best example of that, I always resort to the Irish theme bar. Wherever you go in the world now, you can be in an Irish theme bar that's portraying a sense of Irishness that doesn't actually exist anymore, because you can probably go to an Irish theme bar in the middle of Dublin. That the representation has begun to take precedence over the actual real thing itself, till the whole of central Dublin risks becoming one big Irish theme bar. So the ground of being is this, I'll explain shortly. But what do we understand of existence beyond the here and now? You don't have to be religious to know that if you're going to engage with the world around you, sometimes you need eternal abstract concepts. So a straight line doesn't exist in nature, but in geometry, angles and straight lines and rules and maths, 2 + 2 = 4, these eternal truths we still use at an abstract level. So even people who don't believe in God tend to believe in the eternal truth of basic mathematical logic until some Martians come down to Earth and tell us, no, human maths isn't true. You know, as far as we can tell, they are eternal mathematical truths. So in that sense, what is the basis of our existence? It's this weird combination of the eternal and the temporal, the things, objects that exist in time, but eternal truths, and how we think of the world around us as human beings combines the two. And to repeat, you don't have to be religious to think in those terms. So the perhaps the most famous philosopher, or the one who's looked at this notion of the ground of being, from how do we make sense of objects that just seem to appear into existence? What's the relationship between our notions of existence and actual objects, the eternal and the non-eternal, the temporal, the short-lived? Schelling actually addresses this stuff, and we'll find with the concept of the demonic. I'm going to look at the ideas of a theologian, Paul Tillich, who doesn't use the demonic in any notion of Satanism or anything like that. He refers to the demonic, the way I've described the concept of the eternal, you know, as human beings, we are mortal and temporal and limited to time. Time is one of the crucial themes I've been exploring in the live stream with Proust. And yet we also have this concept of time passing through eternity. We are, as human beings, this weird amalgam. So that's the tension. And in Proust's work, you have this, he's living in the here and now, but over vast stretches of his own life, he almost travels through time, through his memories. And that concept of the memory, it's like the way in which our souls represent ourselves to ourselves. It's memory and its involuntary nature. All of these are ideas that Proust explores. And the concept of the demonic for Paul Tillich is the idea that, I'll explain it in much more detail, but what happens when the tension is lost between the form in which we represent things in art and the content, the thing being represented? Great art keeps that tension. So with very limited means, Homer's just using words. And with those words, he's describing the gods, he's describing the eternal, and he's also describing the deeds of mortal men. And just through the simplicity, you know, with no IMAX cameras, a skilled teller of the Odyssey could encapsulate this constant tension between the gods and humans, the immortal and the mortal. The demonic, according to Paul Tillich, is the way in which, rather than keep that tension, you use the form takes over and becomes demonic and destroys the creativity. So there's a creative tension, but when it goes wrong, the demonic imposes form at an excessive level. So a specific example would be the Grand Inquisitor in Dostoevsky, the brothers Karamazov. The Grand Inquisitor in the story is faced with Jesus Christ himself who's come back to earth. And the Grand Inquisitor basically says, you're not welcome here, go away, because we have set up an institution of the church and we want the form of the church. People are happy with it. People know what's what. You, God, would just confuse things. So this is in literary terms. It's an amazing concept that Dostoevsky expresses with great atmosphere. This old wizened inquisitor, the Grand Inquisitor rejecting Christ. But in these terms, the notion of the demonic, the Grand Inquisitor is demonic because he's insisting upon the form of the church over the substance of God himself. And that's an example of the demonic. And art tends not to be demonic because it keeps the tension. And at its best, art allows us to have a sense of the eternal, just even momentarily. Whereas the demonic is all around us in society, in bureaucracy, in this culture industry. Next talk, I'll talk about the culture industry and mass culture. So think of ultra-processed food. It's the beautiful creativity of haute cuisine food, cordon bleu food, versus ultra-processed food in which the need to make it accessible and efficiently delivered at somewhere like McDonald's takes precedence over the actual quality, the nutritional quality, the skill of the chef. So that would be an example of the demonic. I don't mean to anyone who's got shares in McDonald's, I apologise. But from a strictly technical point of view, that would be an example of Tillich's The Demonic. So this is what I'll talk about next time, though, is the mass medium is the message. The specific implications of IMAX cinema, the use of images, rather than all these philosophical issues. What are the implications of an over-reliance or an over-emphasis upon images? So this is to go through that list. What I'm talking about today is this concept of the epic form and the worldview of the Greeks that I mentioned. So singing, the people who went round telling the story of Odysseus or the Iliad, they were called singers, but obviously they're just reciting. And at the beginning of that first section, I quoted from the Odyssey, you'll notice they invoke the muses, the power of the muses. And what Andrew Ford in this book describes is how this is why it's poetry of the past. It's not poetry as we understand it, because there's almost like a magical effect the Greeks saw in poetry. It was the testimony of the muses. In other words, the inspiration came from the gods. It's not just description. It's a way the Greeks had of anthropomorphizing or characterizing genius or the skill of an artist. They were invoking the muses. They were inspired by the muses. So this is how he describes it. Epic is poetry of the past, although it pretends to be a mere unrhetorical rendering of ancient deeds. It does claim to give a unique access to those events and to bring them especially close to us. This claim, lodged with the muses, as I've just said, distinguishes epic from all of the discourse about the past. Only the version they sponsor is poetic and can bring the past fully before us. To reduce this promise of closeness to a claim for historical accuracy would be anachronistic and feeble. The poet's tales are, of course, presumed true. After all, the past is real. But the muses are less an archive than divinities presiding at a performance, a presentation of deeds as they happened and still happen under their divine purview. So this goes to the notion of we don't fully understand, or it's difficult for us to fully appreciate how the Greeks saw the epics compared to us. because they didn't see a chronological description of events like we do. Herodotus was arguably the first historian, and he famously quipped that he didn't write about previous times because nothing important happened. But there was the Greeks up until Herodotus. They've always had but they had a uniquely Greek relationship to time. So, for example, the ancient Egyptians, of which the Greeks knew quite a bit about their culture, the ancient Egyptians had quite complicated, sophisticated astronomical calculations, the movement of the planets and so on. And when they're dead, when they had a burial, they had the pyramids and they mummified, and they wanted to keep bodies thinking because they had a notion of the passage of time and eternity. The Greeks burnt their bodies on pyres, and the Greeks, one example given is that the Greeks viewed Alexander the Great as almost a reincarnation of Dionysus, the god, or the Romans would call Bacchus, the idea of the god of festivity, the god of wine. There was a life power in Dionysus that the Greeks thought they saw in Alexander the Great. And that goes beyond, that cuts across. It makes chronological time. The ancient Greeks didn't really think like we do in terms of eras. That life for them, the way they thought of the world, was much more immediate. They saw similarities between, vast eras before and the here and now, personified in this notion of heroes doing heroic things. So this is why he's saying closeness to a claim for historical accuracy would be anachronistic. It was about the greater truth. It wasn't about did such a thing happen on such and such a date. It was the inner essence of what was happening. Yet it would be equally anachronistic to translate poetry into a purely aesthetic activity, seeing it, for example, as an artistic representation of painful deeds that makes them pleasurable through the imposition of order and meaning. In a mysterious way, the muses do make the experience of poetry so wholly persuasive and absorbing that it becomes an emotional transport. But this experience is less like aesthetic contemplation than like presence at a divine epiphany or a necromancy. So it's wrong to see it as a chronological, true historical record, but it's also wrong to see a Greek epic like the Odyssey as just poetry. Because as you can see, the claim is that it was much more like a divine epiphany or a necromancy. And remember that phrase, divine epiphany, because that's ultimately what Paul Tillich describes art as. So this notion of our relationship to the eternal, I mentioned earlier Schelling and the ground of being. So I tell you what, he's a difficult read, but these are the type of works he did. But if you've got the time, I'd encourage you to have a look at Schelling. It's addictive is the wrong word. It's fascinatingly abstract, and the writing circles in on itself. But as I'll explain shortly, his implied notions about how human beings conceive of the world around them and what goes on in our heads is actually very, very close to some modern day philosophers of mind like Daniel Dennett. So it's striking how accurate some of Schelling's writing is to actual modern cognitive science, to be honest. So his concept of the system of transcendental realism, this is an example of what I've just mentioned. The self is thus a compound activity, and self-consciousness itself a synthetic act. So he's basically arguing that the self, our notion of self, and it's very hard to explain this because it's so circumlocutory, it's like a moth round a flame. The idea he's expressing circles back on itself, because he's basically saying, in order for you to have a sense of self-consciousness, you have to be able to think of yourself as an object. But you're not an object. You're a reflecting human being whose mind is constantly whirring. So that's why he says the self is thus itself a compound activity, and self-consciousness itself a synthetic act. Self-consciousness, consciousness of ourselves, a perception, our ability to perceive that we're perceiving, is this double-edged thing. On the one hand, we objectify our experience so that we can see it as an object. But on the other hand, we're the people seeing ourselves as an object. So we're not an object, if that makes sense at all. It's this, there is a split at the very nature of human consciousness where two things are going on simultaneously. This conflict is a conflict of activities originally opposed, not so much in subject as in direction, for both are activities of one and the same self. The origin of these two directions is this: the self has an urge to produce the infinite, and this tendency must be thought of as directed outwards, as centrifugal, but it is not distinguishable as such without an activity regressively directed inwards to the self as centre. So it's much more eloquently what I was just saying. We direct our attention outwards. That's what he's calling, using a physics term, centrifugal. But also the centripetal, the inward-looking thing, is how we focus our thoughts. And you have to focus outwards and inwards at the same time to have self-consciousness. The outgoing, by nature, infinite activity is the objective in the self. The self-reverting activity is nothing else but the striving to intuit oneself in that infinitude. So again, there's this simultaneous thing going on. You're recognizing there's an outside world. You're recognizing thoughts of infinity. But you also, if you thought you could think of infinity totally, it would completely swamp your sense of self. So the mind is always doing this thing where it's conceiving of an outside world and it's conceiving of infinity, but it's protecting its own identity. So it's the striving to intuit oneself in that infinitude. And the relevance of all this to Homer, we'll see shortly. But Homer describing epic deeds and the relationship of human beings to the gods is a way of expressing this split. The gods represent infinitude and human beings represent mortality and a sense of self. And Odysseus is uniquely interesting because Odysseus is the rise of a self-conscious, cunning, wildly individual. It's one of the first representations of that. It's much more evident in the Odyssey than it is in the Iliad, which is much more about the centrifugal, whereas arguably the Odyssey is about the centripetal, the inward-looking nature. Through this action as such, the inner and the outer are divided within the self, and with their separation is posited a conflict in the self that only the necessity of self-consciousness can explain. Why the self should have originally to become aware of itself is not further explicable, for it is nothing else but self-consciousness. But within that self-consciousness, a clash of opposing directions is necessary. So why the self should have originally to become aware of the self is not further explicable. So this goes to Schelling's notion of the abyss, the ground of being. What's the origin of self-consciousness? Modern cognitive scientists are trying to explain. In our, wet grey matter in our heads, if you've seen a human brain, this jelly-like weird substance, and yet from that we derive self-consciousness. You've got a fleshy material object of the brain, but it's able to focus outwards and also inwards. And yet, no scientist can point to the precise bit of your brain where your self-consciousness exists. I quite like this. Some have portrayed the contrast between the Iliad and the Odyssey as that between the rising and setting sun. I prefer to call the Iliad the centrifugal. In other words, all these heroic deeds, facing outwards, fighting wars, battles, etc. The Odyssey, the centripetal poem about the cleverness, the wiliness of Odysseus and his various strategies to survive. This is from his philosophy of art. The ancients themselves designate mythology since it is since it is one with Homer, the Homeric poems as the common source of poesy, in other words, an ancient word, well, an antique word for poetry, history and philosophy. For poesy is the primal matter from which all else issued, the ocean, to use an image the ancients themselves used, from which all rivers flow out, and to which all flow back. Only gradually does this mythical material become lost in itself within the historical. One might say, as soon as the idea of the infinite emerges and a relationship to fate can develop. So that's what I was saying about Herodotus. This idea that Herodotus marked the beginning of the loss of the mythical and the tendency to begin to record things in a chronological listing type of way. In the intervening period, because the infinite is yet completely combined with matter itself, and accordingly itself behaves like material reality, that unique divine seed that has been sown in mythology must proliferate for a long period of time in wondrous and great events such as those of the heroic age. So this is an important point. In Homer's epic, the infinite is linked to material reality. The gods exist in the real world, interfering all the time. That unique divine seed that has been sown in mythology must proliferate for a long period of time in wondrous and great events such as those of the heroic age. The laws of common experience have not yet emerged, and whole masses of phenomena are still concentrated in great individual figures, such as is the case in the Iliad. But in the Odyssey, I'm sorry to bang on about emphasize the same point, but in the Odyssey, it becomes more inward directing. It becomes more centripetal rather than centrifugal. Infinite and finite still slumber under a common cloak. Juxtaposed with nature, each of its formations is ideal, infinite, while in relation to art itself, they are completely real, limited, and finite. I'll explain that in a second. This is the reason for the total absence of any ethical concepts in mythology to the extent that they might concern the gods. The latter, in other words, the gods, are organic beings of a higher, absolute, and thoroughly idealistic nature, and they always act as such, always commensurate with their limitations, and for that reason, absolutely. So there's a paradox there. Ironically, the gods are limited. You'd think of gods as completely limitless, but they're limited because they can't be mortal. They're organic beings of a higher, absolute, and thoroughly idealistic nature, and they always act as such, always commensurate with their limitations, and for that reason, absolutely. Morality, like sickness and death, only plagues mortals, and within mortals it can express itself in relationship to the gods only as rebellion against them. So this is the beginning, this is the concept. The gods can only act in an absolute way because morality doesn't affect them. They're not of that nature. Odysseus begins to typify, more than the Iliad. We'll see in Odysseus how he constantly rebels against the gods through various techniques and schemes. Prometheus is the archetype of morality that ancient mythology offers to us. He is the universal symbol of that particular relationship morality occupies within mythology. Because freedom expresses itself in him as independence from the gods, He is chained to the rock and eternally tormented by the vulture sent by Jupiter, a vulture that permanently gnaws at his growing liver. I know that feeling. As such, he represents the whole human race and suffers in his own person the torments of the entire species. Hence, here the infinite does indeed make an appearance, but in that appearance immediately bound again, held back and subjected to limitation. The same is the case in ancient tragedy, where the highest morality lies in the recognition of the boundaries and limitations to which human beings are subject. So I love this, the idea that Prometheus rebels against the gods. So the subtitle to Frankenstein, which we'll be looking at in the live stream, is A Modern Prometheus. So Goethe's Faust has the same idea, this idea of pursuing knowledge to the nth degree and in a certain way rebelling against the gods. But in classical ancient literature, the infinite, as you can see, exists, but it's always punished and limited. So that's why he says, hence here the infinite does indeed make an appearance. But the Prometheus is a brilliant example because he helps humankind gain access to the almost limitless power of technology. And yet, he's bound to the rock for eternity. So humankind and eternity, punishment and the benefits of technology, all these things are held in tension in classical literature. So this raises the question of our relationship to the eternal. So I'll just quickly explain. Most people, insofar as they know of Paul Tillich, the book on the right, The Courage to Be, is relatively famous and well worth a read. It deals with issues of existential anxiety. And in an age where everyday anxiety is prevalent, I think his book, Courage to Be, looks at the notion of courage and how to deal with the anxiety of just being alive at a profound philosophical and theological level. It couldn't be more topical in a way. It's a brilliant, brilliant book. But the interpretation of history is a bit more esoteric, and it's here that he actually explores the concept of the demonic. So before I look at his explanation of the demonic, he did an interview for this Parade magazine in 1955, and the interview was called One Moment of Beauty. But this is Paul Tillich talking about our relationship to the eternal and the infinite, which Homer in his art does. And this is the question, how's Christopher Nolan going to approach the concept of the infinite? He does in his films, so Inception and so on, layers within layers, timescales within timescales. But this is Paul Tillich explaining how to him art allows us to have at least momentary access to the infinite. So this was just after the First World War, where he'd been a chaplain on the front. So going to Berlin, he'd witnessed horrors in the First World War. Verdun specifically, I think. Going to Berlin, I hurried to the Kaiser Friedrich Museum. There on a wall was a picture that had comforted me in battle. Madonna with singing angels, painted by Sandro Botticelli in the 15th century. Gazing up at her, I felt a state approaching ecstasy. In the beauty of the painting, there was beauty itself. It shone through the colours of the paint as the light of day shines through stained glass windows of a medieval church, which is something Proust writes about. As I stood there, bathed in the beauty its painter had envisioned so long ago, something of the divine source of all things came through to me. I turned away, shaken. So that phrase, something of the divine source of all things, came through to me. It's not anywhere specific. It's not the light. If you think back to the image of Plato's cave, it's not the person gazing directly at the sun. It's not the shadow on the cave wall, which is far from the truth. But beauty itself in this painting, he explains as, It shone through the colours of the paint as the light of day shines through the stained glass windows. So it's not even the reflection, it's the emanation of light from the physicality of stained glass. It's the combination. Remember earlier I talked about the tension between form and substance. This is a beautiful example. The sense of the ecstatically beautiful is contained simultaneously within the form and the substance. The light contained within and coming out of either the paint on the painting or the stained glass of the window. A bit like self-consciousness in the brain. You can't point to where precisely the beauty is, but it's there in the combination of the form and the substance. And that's the painting he was talking about. Mary with the Child and Singing Angels, I think circa 1478 by Botticelli. That moment has affected my whole life, giving me the keys for the interpretation of human existence, brought vital joy and spiritual truth. I compare it with what is usually called revelation in the language of religion. I know that no artistic experience can match the moments in which prophets were grasped in the power of the divine presence, but I believe there is an analogy between revelation and what I felt. In both cases, the experience goes beyond the way we encounter reality in our daily lives. It opens up depths experienced in no other way. I now know that the picture is not the greatest. I have seen greater since then. But that moment of ecstasy has never been repeated. And I'll go on now. So I hope I've explained the basic concept. And he makes this statement. He's talking here about primitive art and African art. And he uses that as an example. I'm now going to talk about the concept of the demonic. We have noticed that these objects matter to us, since in them are expressed depths of reality which had, to be sure, escaped our consciousness, but in subconscious strata had never ceased to determine our existence. So I'm going to give you some practical visual examples shortly of what goes on in our subconscious strata. So by referring to primitive and African art and non-Western art, basically, he's suggesting it doesn't have to be, it's not about Western religiosity, it's not about conventional religion. This relationship to something that exceeds the here and now can be found in human culture in general, art in particular. It is, so he's still talking, I'll give you examples, he's still talking about primitive art or non-Western art, if I can say that so I don't offend anyone. It is a peculiar tension that these things contain, in consequence of which they were so long inaccessible to our Occidental consciousness, in other words, Western mindset. They bear forms, human, animal and plant, which we understand as such, recognizing their conformity to artistic laws. But with these organic forms are combined other elements which shatter our every conception of organic form. We cannot interpret this as want of artistic power, as a primitive lack of development, as a limitation of an aptitude or artistic form, and thereby characterize this whole tremendous human production as without cultural value. We must rather watch these elements which break through organic form, lead to a peculiar, in itself necessary and expressive artistic form, in the face of which to speak of lack of form would betray only unfamiliarity and failure of comprehension. Those destructive elements themselves which disrupt the organic form are elements of the organic, but they appear in such a manner that they violate radically the organic coherence presented in nature. So what he's describing here is his theory that The demonic, as he describes it, is to be found in this thing that bubbles up under creativity. So the artist tries to get this beautiful tension between form and substance. And what he's suggesting is, in some art forms, you see hints of the demonic, the way in which the form almost becomes overwhelmed by the substance. So don't get misled that the concept of the demonic is somehow evil. The way Tillich describes it is this constant tension between creation and destruction is what gives art its power. And what you're seeing are hints of the demonic in art that plays or challenges form. So Tillich himself was a massive fan of German Expressionism. It is the vital forces which support the living form, but when they become overpowerful and withdraw from the arrangement within the embracing organic form, they are destructive principles. That it is possible to grasp these creative primeval powers as they break through organic form, and to subordinate them to the unity of artistic creation is perhaps the most astonishing thing which these sculptures and masks reveal to us. For it demonstrates one thing irrefutably: there is something positively contrary to form that is capable of fitting into an artistic form. That's the tension I was describing. There exists not only a lack of form, but also a contradiction of form. There exists not only something less positive, but also something contrapositive. Only by denying, on principle, the aesthetic qualities of an African sculpture or a Shiva picture could one escape this conclusion, i.e., by making classical aesthetics absolute. Whoever cannot assent to this conclusion must admit that human art reveals to us the actuality of that which is positively contrary to form, the demonic. So this is a depiction of one of the manifestations of the Shiva in Hindu religion. And this is an African mask that he's talking about. And now you can see on the left and the right of the African mask in the middle are the influence this had on Picasso, which viewers will know from previous videos. I think it was an absolute genius. But Picasso, I'm not sure whether he read Schelling or Tillich, but this is, you couldn't find a more obvious example of someone who's adapted Tillich's interpretation of the demonic and applied it to their own art. And you can see this is Les Mademoiselles d'Avignon. And if you look at the faces on the right of the women and compare them to the faces on the left, you can see directly the influence of this demonic aesthetic. And there you can see a direct comparison between Picasso's faces and African masks. And this I know these are mostly these three out of the four images are sculptures, not paintings. But these remind me, if people can think back to the video I did on Jean Fautrier, L'Etage series of hostages that look like, to some people, cowpats, and Frank Auerbach's work where the impasto technique, the thickness of the paint, and the image seems to break through out of the form of the paint that's so thick. But it reminds me of the same type of idea, the way in which the substance of the painting and the form, the tension becomes overwhelming. the normal organic balance between the two, form and substance, becomes overwhelmed. The form in these instances almost is exceeded by the substance. So the demonic contains destruction of form, which does not come from without, does not depend on deficiency or powerlessness, but originates from the basis of the form itself, the vital as well as the intellectual. To understand this connection is to grasp what is meant by the concept demonic in its truth and inevitability, that is, in its metaphysical essence. The way to this understanding passes through an analysis of the basic relationship to existence, underlying all our connections with existence, theoretical and practical. So our basic relationship to existence underlying all our connections, theoretical and practical. All of this I'm trying to emphasize with how this basic tension that's been described by Tillich, that's been described by Schelling, and is implicit in Homer's work, how Christopher Nolan is going to allude to this is going to be interesting to see. When we look through the strata of the relation which joins everything with every other, that is, through its interrelationship with the world, then a depth in the thing may be disclosed to us, which we can designate as the pure existentiality of things, their being supported by the basis of existence, their sharing in the abundance of existence. This foundation and this suggestion by things of another thing, which is still no other thing, but a depth in the things, is not rational, that is, demonstrable from the interrelation of things with the world. And the other to which the things point is nothing discoverable by a rational process, but a quality of things which reveals or conceals a view into its depths. So I appreciate this is very wordy and complicated, but essentially he's just describing Tillich as a theologian, the depth of our relationship to the world around us that can be found in art. It points to the underlying, what Schelling would call the grounding of being, the abyss from which things come. And it's the notion of looking into the depths. So I'm trying to think of a practical example, but for example, Monet, the water lilies some of Monet's paintings can be quite biscuit tinny, in other words, kitschy and very pretty, and they can be put on biscuit tins and tea towels. But actually, if you look at some of the water lily l'Orangerie in Paris, the commonly described sensation as you're looking at them, you feel like you're drowning. They're so immersive, the depth. And then as he was losing his eyesight, I encourage people to look at, I've used them before on the channel, but he painted the Japanese bridge in his garden, and it became more and more a bit like Frank Auerbach's painting. The impasto technique became deeper and deeper and deeper. And Monet's late work, I think, is absolutely amazing, but it really does give this sense of a view into its depths. We say of this depth that it is the basis of being of things, whereby being is taken absolutely, transcendently, as the expression of the secret into which thinking cannot penetrate. Because, as something existing, it itself is based thereon. In order to say this, however, we must also say something else, that the depth of things, their basis of existence, is at the same time their abyss, or in other words, that the depth of things is inexhaustible. If it were not inexhaustible, and if it could be exhausted in the form of things, then there would be a direct, rational, designable way from the depths of things to their form. Then the world could be comprehended as the necessary and unequivocal unfolding of the basis of existence. Then the supporting basis would pour out entirely into the cosmos of forms. Then the depth would cease to be depth, ceasing to be transcendental, absolute. So it's, I'm guessing, quite difficult to understand, but he's arguing that it's basically a Schelling type point, that at the grounds of existence is this abyss that's difficult to comprehend, or you can't. He said in the previous quote, you can't rationally access the depth. It's a quality of art that allows you a sense of the depth of things that lies behind their appearances. Every one of our relations in existence, however, suggests that it is directed to something which, despite its finiteness, shares the inexhaustibility of existence. Only through this is it guarded from plunging into the abyss of exhaustibility and emptiness, from succumbing to the lack of being and meaning. Again, it's difficult stuff, but he's describing what I was saying earlier on about this simultaneous existence between things, palpable objects in the world, and our human minds, and the way we also conceive of objects using eternal categories like straight lines, like geometry. And like the previous quotes about self-consciousness, the mind needs to see itself as an object, but at the same time it's an infinite process of thinking and reflecting. Well, it's infinite until we die, but then who knows, it could join the infinite beyond. But it's, again, the mind works. And that's something interesting to think about. The mind works the way that we previously looked at quotes about self-consciousness. The mind simultaneously looks outwards and inwards, and there's this tension. Homer's epic also has this relationship of the gods, the infinite, and the mortals, the finite. And the epic itself encapsulates that tension, which is being described by Tillich and Schelling in a much more philosophical way. But that's arguably the beauty of Homer's epic. It actually contains profound philosophical thoughts about the abyss, the nothingness at the grounding of being, in very accessible stories. So to start rounding up, this is a quote I love from Maurice Blanchot, sorry. Art is not religion. It doesn't even lead to religion. But in the time of distress which is ours, an age when the gods are missing, the time of absence and exile, art is justified, for it is the intimacy of this distress. It's a brilliant phrase. Art is justified, for it is the intimacy of this distress. The effort to represent through images the fallacy of imagery, and eventually the ungraspable forgotten truth that lies behind this error. This is a theme I'll explore in the next talk, this idea of the effort to represent through images the fallacy of imagery. So it's a Jean Baudrillard type point about modern simulated images hide the fact by there is no reality left anymore, because the images are based upon, they're premised upon other images. We think they're referring to an external reality, but external reality itself, according to Baudrillard, has become fatally compromised by constant representations. Now, Tillich's, the way in which Tillich and Schelling differ from Baudrillard is that Tillich and Schelling still think there's a sense of depth and a sense of reality lying behind perceivable reality that we can still access through art. Whereas Baudrillard's a typical French pessimist, smoking a giton, and he would reject that. But I'll finish off with, this is Friedrich Hölderlin. And he wrote this poem, Bread and Wine, which I'm only going to give you an excerpt from, but it speaks directly to the role Homer played and poetry played in our understanding of reality. And again, I'd ask you to think at the back of your minds, how is it all likely to relate to what Christopher Nolan's going to do with his IMAX technology? It really does intrigue me. Holy Greece, home of all the gods, so it's true, what once we heard when we were young. A festival hall whose floor is the ocean, whose tables are the mountains, anciently built for a single purpose. But where are the thrones? Where the temples, the songs, the vases full of nectar for the pleasure of the gods? Where are the oracles that shine for miles and miles? Delphi sleeps, and where does great fate resound? Where does fate suddenly break forth, full of omnipresent joy, thundering out of clear air over our eyes? Father Ether, it called and flew from tongue to tongue 1,000 times, and nobody had to endure life alone. Shared such fortune as a joy, exchanged with strangers, it becomes jubilant. Sleeping, the power of the word grows. Father, joyful, the ancient sign resounds as far as it reaches, inherited from the elders, striking, creating. Thus the gods enter. Thus the season of the gods falls from the shadows down to men, shaking the depths. Remember, the depths is what Schelling and Tillich are talking about. But friend, we come too late. It's true that the gods live, but up over our heads, up in a different world. They function endlessly up there and seem to care little if we live or die. So much do they avoid us. A weak vessel cannot hold them forever. Humans can endure the fullness of the gods only at times. Therefore, life itself becomes a dream about them. But perplexity and sleep assist us. Distress and nighttime strengthen, until enough heroes have grown in the bronze cradle, with hearts as strong as the gods, as it used to be. Thundering they arise. Meanwhile, I often think it is better to stay asleep than to exist without companions, just waiting it out, not knowing what to do or say in the meantime. What use are poets in times of need? But you'll say they're like holy priests of the wine god, moving from land to land in the holy night. So it's questioning the whole. I've only given you a couple of stanzas throughout the whole poem, but I think it summarizes this: what happens in a world without the gods, without the poets to describe man's relationship to the gods. So I'll finish with this idea that the task facing Christopher Nolan, if you ask me, and I think a lot of what I've said is implicitly skeptical about what the task facing Christopher Nolan and how he's going to approach the Odyssey. But in the next talk, I'll talk around further the skepticism by talking about the power of the image and how that's going to affect IMAX technology as the ultimate expression of this power of the image. But at least one author, as you can see here, thinks that there is a transcendent theological property to Christopher Nolan's films. So it'll be interesting what you make of that. So I hope you've enjoyed that. I know it was a bit heavy, but I'll keep exploring it. And I think the Schelling and the Tillich, it's heavy, but I just think it shows you the depth of the significance of the philosophical consequences of Homer. And like I say, with reference to this book, arguably Christopher Nolan, more than most directors and auteurs, will be able to at least tackle some of the profundity of Homer. But we'll see. So until the next time, all the very best. Take care.